Welcome back to History 121, American History 1. In this section, we're going to look at James K. Polk's administration and how the war with Mexico, the territory that the United States is going to acquire from Mexico, is going to indirectly lead to civil war in 1860. Because between the end of the Mexican-American War and the Civil War, the differences over what to do with these territories became the irreconcilable difference that divided North and South, specifically whether slavery should be allowed in these territories. So even before James K. Polk took office, Texas had been acquired. In a treaty on the waning days of the John Tyler administration in 1845, Congress had passed the annexation treaty signed by Tyler, and Texas had been annexed to the United States. But in Polk's vision of what he wanted to accomplish in Western expansion, Texas was small potatoes. In Polk's mind, he has a vision of the United States being a continental country, one that has port cities along the Atlantic as well as Pacific coasts, so that eventually the United States could engage in profitable commerce across the Pacific. In order to realize that dream, Polk felt as though the United States absolutely had to have San Francisco Bay. If you look at the natural harbors along the Atlantic coast, there are quite a few natural harbors that dot the Atlantic coast. You've got New York, you've got the Chesapeake Bay, which is kind of one gigantic natural harbor. If you compare that to the Pacific coast of North America, there are relatively few natural harbors along the Pacific coast. You've got Puget Sound, where modern-day Seattle is. You've got San Francisco Bay, you've got Los Angeles, San Diego, but of the natural harbors along the Pacific, one could make a convincing argument that San Francisco Bay was the best, maybe along the Pacific, maybe in the entire North American continent. And you can get a sense of why Polk and others thought San Francisco Bay was such a wonderful natural harbor when you look at this map in front of you here. The harbor is well protected from storms coming in from the Pacific, because it has that natural narrow inlet. Once you pass that narrow inlet, you can see that San Francisco Bay is absolutely enormous. It's relatively deep, so ocean-going vessels can sail without problem into the harbor. And you can house a sizable navy in San Francisco Bay. So as far as James K. Polk is concerned, Texas fine, but the United States absolutely has to have San Francisco Bay. So as soon as he becomes president, he sends ministers to Mexico to try and negotiate for the purchase of San Francisco Bay. He actually sent the John Slidell down there to try and negotiate for the purchase of everything south to Monterey. But Mexico is disinclined to negotiate, having, as far as Mexico is concerned, already illegally annexed this rebellious province called Texas to the United States. The Mexican legislature was not disposed to go ahead and start selling off more land to the United States. So failing that, Polk began plans to try and goad Mexico into war. And he does this in part by sending a U.S. military general, Zachary Taylor, with an army of several thousand soldiers down to the southern border of Texas along the Nueces River. Now, nothing happened. And so Polk gave the order for Zachary Taylor to move further to Fort Brown on the Rio Grande River. Now this was a controversial move because as far as Mexico is concerned, Texas is still part of Mexico. They didn't recognize that Texas had gained independence, and they certainly did not recognize the United States' acquisition of Texas. But even if they did, they would have thought ridiculous the claim that Texas's borders extended down to the Rio Grande River. Under Spanish rule and under Mexican rule, Texas had always been considered this province east of the Nueces River. So as far as Mexico is concerned, American troops are now invading a Mexican soil and claiming land within Mexico itself. Even then, nothing happened. And Polk was in the process of drafting a declaration of war message to send to Congress, asking Congress to declare war because of failure to pay debts. Didn't look like that would fly. When Polk finally got what he wanted, which was Mexican troops crossed the Rio Grande, attacked Zachary Taylor, and then he could go to Congress and ask for a declaration of war, stating that American blood had been spilled on American soil. Now, like the War of 1812, the declaration of war that creates the Mexican-American War is going to be one of the most controversial declarations in U.S. history. Many of the Whigs were adamantly opposed to any war with Mexico. A junior congressman by the name of Abraham Lincoln gave a famous spot speech in Congress. He dared Polk to come to Congress and show him the map and the spot on the map where American blood had been spilled on American soil, because he and many others like him were convinced that this was an illegal war, that Mexico had been pushed into war so that the United States could engage in a sort of land grab, taking advantage of its weaker neighbor to the south. So Lincoln was opposed to it. Many other Whigs were opposed to it. When the declaration of war went through and did pass, many Whigs decided to go ahead and provide funding for the war. Remembering what happened to the Federalist Party in the War of 1812, the Whigs were disinclined to go ahead and eliminate themselves as an effective political unit by resisting the war once it had already been declared. But there are some congressmen who are still convinced that this is not on the up and up, that this war has been declared unfairly. And so a congressman by the name of David Wilmot adds a rider onto a spending bill that says, fine, we'll go ahead and pay for this war, but we insist that any territory at the conclusion of this war that is acquired from Mexico, that slavery will not be allowed in this territory. As you can imagine, Southern senators and congressmen were outraged about this. It didn't pass, but it's a sign of how divisive this controversy is going to become. What will be the status of these territories that will be acquired from Mexico at the conclusion of this war? Particularly galling for many in the North was the fact that Polk went to war with Mexico, but when it came to American claims in the Oregon country, the Polk administration compromised. The Polk administration did the sensible thing of simply extending the border between Canada and the United States through the Oregon country along the 49th parallel, with that little dip you can see on the map in front of you around Vancouver Island, so that both British Canada and the United States could take advantage of the natural harbor of Puget Sound. Now, it makes a lot of sense, but for many in the North, this was seen as a betrayal. When it came to the Southern interest, Polk not only acquired Texas, actually it was acquired before he became into office, but not only got Texas, but also went to war to even acquire more land further south. But when it came to Northern interests in the North, the Polk administration gave about half and compromised. Now, in Polk's mind, this makes a lot of sense. The United States military was incredibly small by today's standards in this day and age, and the United States could ill afford to have a two-front war, much less a two-front war with one nation, the British, who were in the midst of an incredible resurgence of national power in the 19th century. But for many Northern Americans, this is seen as a betrayal. Now, militarily, the war goes incredibly well for the United States. The map on the slide in front of you shows several invasions into Mexican-held territory. John C. Fremont led a sort of counterinsurgency campaign into California, where he planned to try and foment a rebellion in California, akin to what had happened in Texas, to have the Californians declare independence and then encourage the Californians to seek annexation of the United States. That's why the California flag still makes reference to this Bear Flag Revolt that happened during the Mexican-American War. At the same time, there are military invasions that conquer New Mexico, Arizona, Southern California. So within the year of the war's declaration, the U.S. had acquired the territory that Polk had wanted it to acquire, but the Mexican government was not inclined to surrender and concede the loss of all this territory. They were going to fight on. They ignored U.S. peace envoys. And so eventually what it took was an invasion of central Mexico itself. A general named Winfield Scott, with a naval flotilla, launched an invasion through Veracruz on the Mexican coast, cut off his supply lines, marched inland with an army of just tens of thousands of soldiers to conquer a city that was already enormous, Mexico City. And he did it. He conquered Mexico City, and once Mexico City falls, the Mexican government feels as though the jig is up, that they're not going to be able to recover this lost territory. They might as well go ahead and sue for peace. Now, with the Mexican-American War over, The second party system that had only come into existence 10, 15 years earlier is already starting to fall apart. Many of the Whigs in the Whig Party have decided to bolt, particularly a group called the Conscience Whigs. The Conscience Whigs were Northern Whigs who were abolitionist-minded Whigs, that they were opposed to the institution of slavery. They didn't want to stay within a Whig Party that was willing to fund this, what they regarded, illegal war with Mexico, and so many of these Conscience Whigs bolted from the party. So at the conclusion of the Mexican-American War, we see a bunch of new third parties pop up to kind of fill this vacuum left as the Whig Party begins to disintegrate at the end of the war. One of those third parties is known as the Know Nothing Party. It's kind of a funny name for a political party. It gets that name because supposedly it was a secret organization. If you asked a member about this political organization, that person would say that he knew nothing. And so they became the Know Nothing Party. Essentially, the Know Nothing Party was an anti-immigration party. In the 1840s, lots of immigrants were coming from overseas, particularly from Ireland and from Central Europe, where the modern-day state of Germany is located. In Ireland, many people were fleeing in the 1840s because of the Irish potato famine. Starvation was a reality in Ireland, and rather than face starvation, lots of people migrated to the United States. In Central Europe in the 1840s, there were a series of revolutions, particularly in 1848, and so lots of those people also left and came to the United States. Now, for many Americans, this is alarming because they, by the 1840s, came to regard the United States as a Protestant country, and many of these immigrants were Catholic. The vast majority of the Irish immigrants who came to the United States were Catholic, and about half of the German immigrants who came to the United States were Catholic. And so a growing political movement suggested that there was this supposedly secret conspiracy led by the Pope to inundate the United States with Catholic immigrants who would eventually become a majority in the United States. And then once they became a majority, they would carry off elections and eventually elect the Pope to be president, and then this Protestant experiment in the United States would be over. The racist political cartoon you see in front of you is a cartoon put out by the Know Nothing Party. It's a nice expression of what they think they believe about German and Irish immigrants coming to the United States. You can see here that they're characterized as alcoholics. The German immigrant is encased in a barrel of beer. The Irish immigrant is encased in a barrel of whiskey. In the background, you can see them brawling in the streets. The Know-Nothings had little regard for the intellectual capacities of these people, and they believed them rather brutish and simple and prone to engage in violence. And you can see between these two characterizations of immigrants, you can see them carrying off the ballot box. The big fear was that once they became the majority of Americans, they would be able to do with elections whatever they wanted. Now there's another party that's got a sort of conspiratorial bent to it called the Free Soil Party. That comes into existence at the end of the Mexican-American War. And the slogan of the Free Soil Party, free labor, free soil, free men, eventually becomes the slogan of the Republican Party when that comes into existence in the 1850s. And it's a good point to stop and reflect on what exactly the Free Soil Party meant by free labor, free soil, free men. When they talked about free soil, they were concerned about the soil out west. That any territories that the United States currently had ought to be free territories where slavery was not allowed. And when they talked about free men, they weren't so much concerned about the enslaved African slaves of the South. They were concerned about the hardworking, middling class of the North, and wanted to make sure that those people would be able to pass on their economic status to their children. And many in the Free Soil Party were concerned that if slavery is allowed to move out west, then there's no way that their children, their white children who are going to inherit this middle-class status from their parents, that they could move out west and achieve the same status that their parents enjoyed. Because the feeling of many in the North is that when you go into the slave South, you have three classes of people. You've got the incredibly wealthy slave-owning class at the top. You've got the slaves at the very bottom, and then just above the slaves, you had the non-slave owning white poor of the South. And so for many in the North, the feeling is if slavery is allowed to move out west, what you're going to see is a repetition of that same system, in which the vast majority of whites are cast down into this desperately poor population just above the enslaved population, and there's no way a hardworking, white, middling class person is going to be able to achieve economic independence out there. So when they talk about free labor, what they're talking about is the independence of the laborers in the North. They're really actually not big supporters of wage labor. Wage labor was seen by many at this time as a temporary status. One worked for wages for a time until you saved up enough money, if you were a craftsman, to buy your own shop and own your own facilities and be your own boss. If you were a lawyer, to own your own law offices. So for many, the idea of wage labor was not the end goal, but rather a temporary stage that one in the North maintained until you saved enough money to become a sort of small business person, as we would think of it today. So they're really not all that fond of wage labor because they consider wage labor to be a temporary expedient. They don't really like it as a permanent condition. But what they're trying to achieve is preserving the West as a reserve for white laborers in the North to move and maintain that same economic status for their children. And on the political cartoon in front of you is a vision of how the Free Soil Party generally regarded the policies of the United States. That on the picture in front of you is a caricature of a rather hard-working, average, white Northern American. And you can see various politicians who have tied him down to a table and are pulling his mouth open and shoving this slave down his mouth. That for the Free Soil Party, there was this sense that slavery was being forced down the mouths of a northern white public that did not want it. So what to do with these territories? All these lands acquired from Mexico. One proposal is to simply extend the Missouri Compromise line through the territories. It would seem kind of fair if you look at on the map in front of you where Missouri's southern border is. If you extend that on a sort of curved line through the west, you can see that most of that land acquired from Mexico would be about split in half. About half would go north, half would go south. Didn't carry a whole lot of weight at this particular moment. Instead, these other plans tended to dominate the national imagination. You have the extreme northern position voiced by the Free Soil Party, which is that all of the land acquired from Mexico ought to be free territory. The argument is often articulated by this person, William Seward, who eventually becomes Abraham Lincoln's Secretary of State. And the argument is essentially that if you look at the founding generation, the people who wrote the Constitution, the people who declared independence, if you look at those people, you'll notice that those people believed that slavery would come to an eventual end. Because if you look at the drafting of the Northwest Ordinance, written by Thomas Jefferson, you'll see that he intentionally left slavery out of the Northwest Territories, meaning the modern-day states of Ohio, Illinois, and Ohio, Illinois, Indiana. He intentionally left slavery out of those states because, as Seward often understood it, he believed that slavery would come to an eventual end. And so for them, they're sort of original intent interpreters of the Constitution. Let's look at what the original founders of the Constitution wanted when they created this country as it currently exists. And we'll see that they intended for slavery to come to a slow decline. And if we allow slavery to be extended beyond its current borders, that effort will be slowed down. That slavery will not come to a gradual end. So we should restrict slavery to its current boundaries and not let it grow any bigger. So that's the more extreme northern position. On the other hand, you've got the extreme southern position, which is articulated by one of South Carolina's senators, John C. Calhoun, who argues that slavery ought to be allowed in all the territories. John C. Calhoun looks at the Constitution and says, look, we've got this takings clause that protects Americans' property. The national government cannot simply take your property away from you without just compensation unless you've committed a crime or something. And he says, what would it be if slave owners were forced to set their slaves free or leave their slaves at home before they ventured into the territories? That would be a taking, says Calhoun. And because it would be a taking, unless the federal government's willing to compensate slave owners who move to these territories for the property they've been forced to abandon, slave owners have to be allowed to take their slaves into the territories. So in other words, the natural conclusion of Calhoun's arguments is that slave owners ought to be allowed to take their slaves to any of the territories, so slavery in all the territories. So on the one hand, we've got the extreme southern position of slavery in all the territories. You've got the extreme northern position of slavery in none of the territories. You've got the potential compromise of extending the Missouri Compromise line beyond the Louisiana Territory through the rest of the continent. And then you've got another option, popular sovereignty, articulated by this representative from Michigan, Lewis Cass. And popular sovereignty says, look, we live in this land of a white male democracy, in which in most of the states it's white men who vote. Again, some of the states allowed black male suffrage, but most of the states restrict voting to white men. So let's let the white men who move out there decide. Let's let the popular majority, the voting majority, let's let that group of people decide whether they want slavery or not. That seems fair enough. This is a republic in which the voters get to decide these kinds of things. The problem with that, as we'll see going forward, is it's not exactly clear as to when that will be decided. Is it decided when the territories form a territorial legislature? Is it not decided until they submit a constitution for approval to the U.S. Congress? It's not exactly clear, and that will be a problem, especially when we get into Kansas in the 1850s. But at least in 1848, a lot of thinking politicians are under the impression that all of this can wait. That there isn't exactly a rule in the Constitution about when territories can apply for statehood, but there were generally accepted principles that had to be reached, and one of them is a population principle. And many in Congress felt, well, these places are fairly sparsely populated, there aren't a whole lot of people in there, so let's go ahead and just hold off, make cooler heads will prevail in the future, and it'll maybe be decades before we have to worry about these places becoming states. And so in the presidential election of 1848, both of the candidates tended to waffle. They didn't come down very hard on what exactly they would do regarding these territories, and in part because they didn't feel like they had to. The Whigs returned to their winning strategy of nominating a war hero. Zachary Taylor, known as Old Rough and Ready by his soldiers, was a military hero from the Mexican-American War. Won election to president, and it was the winning strategy of the Whigs in getting presidents elected to the White House. But unfortunately for those people who hoped to wait and hoped that the issue could be settled decades in the future, we get the California Gold Rush. In 1848, gold is discovered outside of Sacramento, and within a year, tens of thousands of people have poured into California. On the image in front of you is a picture of San Francisco Bay. At the time of the gold rush, ship's captains had no problem finding sailors willing to staff ships to go to San Francisco Bay, but they discovered once they got there, all the sailors jumped ship and took claims out in the gold mines, and they couldn't find any workers willing to staff the ships to head out of San Francisco Bay. As a result, San Francisco Bay became a virtual graveyard of ships because they just didn't have the sailors available to sail back out of San Francisco Bay. So very quickly, California more than reaches the sort of benchmark for applying for statehood. It was clear the residents out there wanted to become a state. They wanted to become a state so they could issue the kind of laws they needed to govern their society more effectively. And it was also clear that though Californians were certainly not racially progressive in their thinking, they did not want their state to become a slave state. That the vast majority of these people believed that if slavery were allowed to come into California, there was no way a hard-working white miner would be able to achieve the kind of status he wanted, competing with these unpaid slave laborers. And so Zachary Taylor wasn't able to put it off, and he's forced to come up with some sort of plan to deal with the crisis. And the plan he issues alienates many Whigs in the South. Taylor says, we can't put it off, we've got to decide, so let's use the principle of popular sovereignty. Let's let the voters out there decide for themselves, and not just in California, but in the rest of the territory too. Now this is alarming for many in the South, because clearly Californians would have voted to become a free state. In the northern part of this territory acquired from Mexico, the region was dominated by a religious group called the Mormons, who had moved out there after their leader Joseph Smith had been murdered. And though the Mormons did not have much to say about slavery, and they weren't clearly anti-slavery by any means, there were not many slaves in the region that is now Utah today. And it was all clear that they too would have voted to make their region a free state. In New Mexico had a long history of bound labor in one way or another. But New Mexicans generally hated Texas with a passion. There actually, at the time of Taylor's administration, was a kind of civil war going on along the border between Texas and New Mexico. New Mexicans greatly resented the idea of the Rio Grande border for Texas, because this would have taken the state of Texas west to the point of being on the very gates of Santa Fe, which today is in the middle of New Mexico. And so basically New Mexicans hated anything that had to do with Texas, and generally they associated slavery with Texas. And so if they too had the option of becoming a slave state or a free state, they too would have opted to become a free state, if only because they hated Texas with a passion. So clearly, in the minds of many Southerners, Taylor's plan, even though he was from Louisiana, was a slave owner in the sugar regions of southern Louisiana, his plan would have been a catastrophe for the South in creating at least 3 new free states for the United States. But Zachary Taylor dies. The poor Whigs, they couldn't keep their presidents alive. Zachary Taylor lives on a bit longer than William Henry Harrison, but he too dies while in office. Supposedly he choked on a strawberry and developed an infection and eventually died. That seems a little hard to believe. It seems more likely that he developed throat cancer or something like that. But he dies while in office. His replacement is a political non-entity, doesn't really do much to shape this decision over what to do. And so the mantle of the decision falls to Congress. And it's going to be particularly in the Senate where Henry Clay is going to hammer together a compromise that's going to allow California to come in as a free state. So the Compromise of 1850 recognizes the inevitable. It allows California to become a free state in the United States. You can imagine many in the South did not like that at all. And so in order to soothe the hurt feelings of many in the South, the United States also passes a law that greatly strengthens the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, from the very beginning of the United States, from the inception of the Constitution, there had been rules in place about the return of escaped bound laborers to their points of origin. What the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 does is it greatly strengthens the requirements of states where fugitive slaves have run to return those slaves to their point of origin. For example, the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 makes it quite clear that the local law enforcement officer is in charge of actually capturing this fugitive slave. And if this law enforcement officer deems necessary, he can sort of deputize private citizens in the community to help him retrieve this slave. And if those private citizens refuse to help, they could be imprisoned, they could be fined. And for many in the North, this is seen as just a step too far. That what do we have but the slave South not only demanding that the white North help them in the return of these slaves without any pay, and risk their lives to do so, because presumably these runaway slaves probably don't want to be returned to slavery, and they're not going to get a dime out of it. This is an attempt on the part of the slave-owning South to now take over the labor of the white North and use it for their own purposes through the Fugitive Slave Act. So it's incredibly unpopular in the North. The Compromise of 1850 also resolves the boundary dispute between New Mexico and Texas. Essentially, Texas accepts the more sensible boundaries that it currently has today in exchange for the United States nationalizing its state debts. The Republic of Texas, when it had been an independent republic, had enormous debts, and the U.S. government took those over, agreed to pay them down in exchange for Texas accepting the current boundary between Texas and New Mexico. And it organized the Utah Territory and the New Mexico Territory, but did not say what the future status of slavery would be in those places. It left that issue to be decided in the future. Now, I cannot emphasize enough how unpopular the Fugitive Slave Act is in the North. On the slide in front of you is a picture of Anthony Burns. He was a fugitive slave who ran away from his master in Virginia, eventually wound up in Boston, and in 1854 was recaptured under the rules of the Fugitive Slave Act. Now, huge mobs gathered outside of the courthouse as federal marshals tried to bring him to court to stand trial. Eventually, one of the federal marshals is killed. A grand jury was called together to try and prosecute some individuals for having killed this federal marshal. and the grand juries would not convict. They would not agree on a decision. Eventually, the prosecutors had to drop it. $40,000 had to be spent by the federal government to escort Anthony Burns, to bring in the federal officials necessary, the federal police protection necessary to take him to court and back, and eventually put him on a boat to send him back to Virginia. Eventually, some abolitionist groups, led primarily actually by black abolitionists out of Boston, paid $1,300 for his release from Virginia. So it's an example of how outraged many in the Northern public were. Many of these people didn't even need to be sympathetic to African Americans in the South. They were simply angry about the way white Southerners had requisitioned their labor without their permission, without compensation, and expected them to risk their lives in the return of fugitive slaves that they just couldn't hold on to. So tensions are quite high at the beginning of the 1850s. There's an incredible sense of Northern and Southern sectionalism, and the Fugitive Slave Act is certainly contributing to that. And during the 1850s, now that California is a state, railroad lines had been built throughout the Northeast and the Midwest, and some lines in the South as well. And there's talk of creating a new transcontinental railway, a rail line that would connect the eastern lines of the East to this new state of California and the lines out there. And you could imagine that every senator in some of these more western states, meaning like Illinois and Louisiana, all of these senators want their state, rather than other states, to become the terminus of the eastern portion of this transcontinental railroad. So being a good senator from Illinois, Stephen Douglas wants to make sure that Chicago wins the bid as the eastern terminus of this transcontinental railroad. Now, there was certainly a good argument to be made in favor of a city like New Orleans. Texas was already a state. Presumably this railroad would have to travel through Texas. It would then travel through New Mexico, which had a more sizable population, before it headed to Southern California. Now, hurting Illinois' bid was the fact that all of this land north and west of Missouri had been unorganized. It was not on the road towards statehood. And what were they to do with all that? So there weren't many people living out there, and it's hard to run a railroad without very many people living in a place. So Douglas wants to put these places on the road towards statehood so that they can increase their populations. But he also knows that because of the Missouri Compromise of 1820, he's not going to be able to get Southern senators to help him with that project, because they know that any states formed out of these territories will become free states. So Douglas puts together an organization act to organize the territories of Kansas and Nebraska in 1854, and he makes explicit in these organization acts that the slavery will be decided on the principle of popular sovereignty. Now in the North, this is seen as a betrayal. These lands were supposed to be the inheritance of their children, and what has Stephen Douglas done here but allowed the possibility that these places might become slave states at some point in the future. On the slide in front of you is a picture expressing the outrage of many in the North regarding Douglas's act. You can see on the slide Douglas is portrayed as a petulant child being whipped by Lady Liberty. And if you look at the switch in her right hand, you'll see that it's labeled the Maine Law. That's a reference to the Missouri Compromise, the principle established at the time that Maine and Missouri became states. In the background is the ghost of Benjamin Franklin, who is chastising Douglas for his petulance. So it's an incredibly controversial law. It passes. The Kansas-Nebraska territories are organized without any statement regarding slavery, and presumably they'll be decided on the basis of popular sovereignty. And the result is that Northern Democrats find themselves kicked out of office. If they were Northern Democrats who voted in favor of the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Northern public reacted against them by kicking them out of office and replacing them. Now, as the Whig Party is essentially ceasing to exist over the course of the 1850s, the Democratic Party will continue to exist, but it becomes an increasingly Southern-dominated party. On the chart in front of you is a list of the various Democratic representatives in Congress. So in the House, representation is decided by population. So each state gets representatives in the House based upon how many people live there. By 1846, the northern population was far outstripping the southern population. So you can see in 1846, there's a relatively equal balance between northern and southern representatives in the House. But I would emphasize that this already shows a sort of southern bent to the party, because if there were equal representation from the North and the South from the Democrats in the House, we would expect to see a northern majority, because that's the way the population was, that there was a northern majority in the national population. But in 1846, there's an even balance, but you can see by 1858, on the eve of the Civil War, only a third of the representatives in Congress are from northern states. So increasingly, by the time we get to the eve of the Civil War, the Democratic Party is becoming more and more of a sectional party. It's becoming the party of the enslaved South. And it's in the 1850s where we see the new Republican Party, the Republican Party that we have today, come into existence. They eventually absorb the Free Soil Party and adopt the Free Soil Party slogan for their own. Free labor, free soil, free men. And essentially they mean the same thing by it. When they talk about free soil, free labor, free men, they're primarily concerned about the free labor of white men. They're not concerned about where slavery already exists. This is not an abolitionist party. There was, in fact, an abolitionist party at the time called the Liberty Party. The Republican Party is only concerned about the extension of slavery. They're only concerned about preventing the extension of slavery into any current or future territories, keeping it within the boundaries where it already exists. That's their big thing. And the Republican Party is going to absorb a lot of different political interest groups. Some Northern Democrats who joined the party, sometimes explicitly for revenge. They resent what the Southern Democrats have done to their party, and they join the Republicans to get back at their former Southern colleagues. The Republican Party absorbs a lot of the Know-Nothing Party. Although, interestingly enough, by the time that 1860 election rolls around, the Republican Party does not reflect the primary know-nothing interest at all. In fact, the 1860 party platform adopts an explicitly pro-immigration agenda. And that's in part because of the influence of German-American Republicans. These Republicans, particularly out of states like Wisconsin, let the National Party know there's no way that you can adopt an anti-immigration platform and expect to win Wisconsin. So the absorption of the know-nothings into the party without shaping their platform at all is an indication of where public sentiment is going. The supposed conspiracy led by the Catholics of Europe and the Pope in Rome was not bearing much fruit. It didn't seem to generate a lot of interest, but over the course of the 1850s, there was increasing emphasis on this conspiracy coming out of the South, that supposedly there really was a conspiracy of pro-slavery Southerners to try and force slavery down the throats of an unwilling Northern public. Certainly the Fugitive Slave Act is supposedly a sign of that, but we'll see that there are lots of other signs too. Particularly in Kansas. Kansas, after it's organized as a territory, becomes a sort of civil war within a civil war. That there are anti-slavery forces in Kansas, pro-slavery forces in Kansas. The anti-slavery folks formed an anti-slavery legislature in Lawrence. The pro-slavery folks in Kansas formed a pro-slavery territorial legislature in Lecompton, Kansas. The president at the time, elected in 1854, pushed for the recognition of the Lecompton legislature, and many in the North are outraged. They argue, well, wait a minute here, it's clear there's a majority of anti-slavery folks in Kansas, and yet the national government wants us to accept the legitimacy of the Lecompton legislature. It appears as though, in the conspiratorial minds of many in the North, that the president is in the pocket of the pro-slavery interest. One of the anti-slavery folks working in Kansas is a fellow named John Brown. John Brown had committed himself at this point to the destruction of slavery when pro-slavery forces sacked Lawrence, as it became known. It was a drunken sort of riot that resulted in the burning of several buildings, including an abolitionist press in Lawrence. John Brown, in particular, was outraged. He found the first pro-slavery group of Missourians he could lay his hands on and murdered them all at Pottawatomie Creek. So he's a wanted man, and he eventually goes east to plot a new plan to try and destroy slavery. And it's here that you'll read about John Brown in After the Fact. That his plan seems to be ill-conceived, and yet was he in fact mentally ill? That's the question that you're reading from After the Fact is going to interrogate. Deciding such things based upon the rather scanty evidence from the past is a rather difficult task, and you'll get a sense of how difficult it is when you read about John Brown in your reading. On the slide in front of you is an artist's depiction of John Brown at the end of his trial, when he was convicted of treason for having led this raid on the federal munitions depot at Harper's Ferry, the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry. It's a fanciful depiction. It's not a depiction of what actually happened. You can see John Brown being led to the gallows here, kissing an enslaved baby, presumably on his way there. Of course, that didn't actually happen. But it does give you the sense by the time that John Brown's trial is done, he's generally regarded as everybody's favorite grandpa. He came into the trial regarded by many in the North as a wild man, a crazy lunatic. But during the trial, he presents himself rather well. He presents himself as a champion trying to destroy slavery. When he's executed, church bells across the North ring out in commemoration of John Brown's life. And for many in the white South, this is seen as a sign of what they knew all along. That in the North, the entire society is populated by abolitionists. They are secretly trying to destroy slavery everywhere. All this talk about the non-extension of slavery is just a ruse to try and destroy slavery everywhere. And the support for John Brown is just a further proof that this is the case. Now in 1856, a Northern Democrat from Pennsylvania named James Buchanan is going to be elected president. When you look at these Time magazine rankings of best and worst presidents, Buchanan is often ranked down at the very bottom as the worst president. And that's probably justifiable. His presidency is going to be disastrous for a number of reasons, in particular for having created further and further tensions between the North and the South. During his inauguration in 1857, he gives his speech and says, well, wait a minute, there's this case that's being heard by the Supreme Court right now, and they're deciding upon this, and we should all go along with whatever they decide. That this court case has the potential to solve the problem of what slavery's status is in the territories, and we should all just go ahead and go along with whatever they decide. Now, Buchanan was playing a bit naive here. He actually knew quite well what the court was going to decide. It had been working very hard to make sure the court would decide the way he wanted it to decide, which was that the person who was claiming freedom should be kept as a slave. Buchanan was regarded as a doughface. Doughface in this day and age kind of meant what we mean today by spineless. It meant that the person's face was dough in the hands of whoever was molding it, so that they didn't have their own vision of things. They didn't present their own positions, but instead let others make those positions for them. And at this time, the word doughface often referenced Northern politicians who were Southern in their sympathies, that they were letting Southerners shape their public perceptions. So the court case that James Buchanan was referencing in his inaugural address was the Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott had been the slave of a U.S. military officer who had been stationed at Jefferson Barracks in just south of St. Louis. And as is the case for military officers, he got transferred. And for a time, he was transferred up to the Minnesota Territory, which was clearly part of the agreement from the Missouri Compromise. And therefore, it was a free territory. When he was restationed back to St. Louis, Dred Scott came back with him. He found some lawyers willing to take his case, and Dred Scott sued to become a free person, claiming that his master had brought him to a free territory, and so he ought to be free. Now, there were actually quite a few court cases like Dred Scott's case leading up to 1857, and it had become a principle in Missouri law at this point that if you were a slave owner and you brought your slave to a free territory with an intention of making a permanent home for yourself there, then your slaves would become free. If you were just going for a visit, to visit a relative or whatever, then that would not be the case, that your slave would still be a slave. But if you're moving to a free region with the eye of making a permanent home there, then you cannot bring your slaves with you. That's the way the courts ruled in Missouri, because this is the way that the principle had become established in Missouri. It eventually goes all the way to the Supreme Court, and the Roger Taney Court is going to overturn that decision and adopt a new principle that's going to outrage many in the North and convince them that the abolitionists were right about this slave power argument. What the Supreme Court says is twofold. One, Dred Scott cannot sue in a court because he's not a citizen. He's not a citizen because he is black. They don't say because he's a slave, they say because he is black. The Taney Court says that citizenship only applies to America's white residents. It does not apply to black residents, and therefore, slave or free, black people cannot sue or be sued in court because they are not citizens. That would have been controversial enough. He could have just left it there, actually, because the case would have been settled. Can't sue, all done. But instead, he went further and said, second of all, he should remain a slave because his master brought him into a territory administered by the national government, and if the national government insisted that he should be free because his master had brought him there, it would be a taking under the Takings Clause. And the national government can't take your property away from you without just compensation, so Dred Scott should stay a slave. So what the Taney Court did was adopt the extreme Southern position articulated by John C. Calhoun. Slavery in all of the territories. And some alarmists in the North, reading the decision, say, well, the natural conclusion of this is that slave owners would be allowed to take their slaves into free states as well. The decision didn't actually say that, but some alarmists in the North suggest if you take the logic and apply it to where slave owners can and cannot take their property, where can they not take their property? Couldn't they take their property up into Massachusetts with them and not have it removed from them because of their this takings clause? It's seen not as a decision that's going to settle this matter, a nice compromise between the North and the South, but instead it's seen by many in the North as just further confirmation that the national government is in the hands of slave owners who are going to use this national government for their own purposes and to the detriment of hardworking white northern middle class people who don't want slavery next door. And the problems in Kansas just will not go away. During the Buchanan years, we see the Lecompton legislature create a pro-slavery constitution, submit it to the voters of Kansas for approval. Most of the anti-slavery folks in Kansas boycott the election. There's clear sense of an illegal election taking place here. Missourians quite clearly crossed the border into Kansas, stuffed ballot boxes with approving votes. And that's the Constitution that's sent to Congress for approval. Buchanan encouraged Congress to go ahead and pass this Constitution and make Kansas a slave state. And again, many in the North were outraged. It was clear this was an illegal election. It was clear that the anti-slavery population of Kansas was about 2/3 of the population at this point, and only about 1/3 actually wanted slavery. And so what else would explain why the president was pushing so hard to make Kansas a slave state other than the possibility that in fact the national government had been taken over by the slave interest? On the slide in front of you is a quote from a Republican from Maine, this new political party founded on the principle of non-extension of slavery into the territories. And this particular quote suggests that this conspiratorial mindset has now become part of the mainstream political agenda. This is no longer as it was in the 1830s, the opinions of a few fringe political activists known as abolitionists, but now the basic outlines of the slave power conspiracy argument are becoming voiced by sitting senators in Congress. And what is Senator Fessenden pointing to but various events that had occurred between the 1840s and 50s to show that, in fact, the national government has been taken over by the pro-slavery interest. He's got a reference to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the repeal of the Missouri Compromise that occurred during the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Dred Scott decision in 1857, that all of this is just evidence of this takeover of the national government.